And this is like redemption. I love it. Thanks for coming. Now, it helps that I have really cool people coming like Chris, but hey. So again, thank you for coming to our meetup. And I want to first make a couple of announcements. As I mentioned, we've been recording each of these meetups, and they're online. I put the link at the meetup website, so you can go into the comments and into the storage where we put different files. Sometimes I put slides, and the speaker gives us the slides. And of course, then there's links to the audio and sometimes to the video. So if you have any questions, just ping me through the website, no problem. I will first let Martin, the director of Nissan Research Center. Actually, I have one more announcement. Peter, are you here?
Yep.
Peter wanted to make a short announcement.
I passed around these postcards. There's the premier conference on Qt. For those of you who don't know, there's like Unix uses Qt. They're one of the major operating systems on automotive and stuff. So there are these sessions on why Qt and try Qt if you don't know that much about it. And you can go to those for free using the code on the postcard I was passing around. If you don't have one, get one from me. Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Peter. Okay, so I will actually have Martin Searhouse, the director of Nissan Research Center, introduce Chris.
Good evening, everybody. Thanks for coming again. Somebody asked me last time when we had the Google guy here to the talk, Anthony. He said, "Oh, how are you going to match that one?" And I'm like, "Well, this next week over here, Chris." So I think we went beyond the Google card. We have Chris here, but no, I really.
Lower expectations.
Yeah,
It's this one right here.
Oh, sorry, maybe that's
So I'm really happy that we've been after him for a while.
Yeah.
But he's traveling so much and on sabbatical, how those professors are. But anyway, it's really great to have him here. So Chris, he got his PhD from Berkeley, way back in 1996, he told me, and then he worked for competitors, I find out, at Mercedes-Benz, and then decided to become a true academic and go to the university. And that's really a man after my own heart. I think I really appreciate that, going back to academia and teach and think about the hard problems. And he runs the dynamic systems design lab at Stanford in the mechanical engineering department. Also is the director of CARS, which is a group at Stanford that really is bringing together actually a lot of the automotive people and the people in the in the industry to think together about the tough problems that we have, and that's really also very much appreciated. So without further ado, Chris Gerdes.
Martin, Greg, thanks so much. It's really a great pleasure to be here. Thanks, first of all, for hosting these. I think this is a great opportunity to get people together who are interested to talk about these sorts of topics. I'm really glad that you're doing it here. As you mentioned, I've been traveling, so I'm sorry I haven't been able to make it to more of these. And thanks to all of you for coming out. Wow, there's a lot of things to do on a Thursday night, and I'm glad that you chose to spend a little bit of time here with me. I hope it'll be worth your while. What I'd like to do tonight is to talk to you a little bit about what we've learned from looking at human race car drivers and how these sorts of things can actually help us to influence how autonomous vehicles or driver assistance systems may work in the future. My plan is not to talk for the whole period of time. I sort of cut this down, so I figure I'll go talk for about half an hour or so and then leave the rest of the time open for questions. So if you have anything that relates to my talk, if there's something that you're totally confused about, go ahead and ask it here. If you want to talk sort of more broadly about things or deep philosophical questions of automated driving, maybe we can leave that for the Q&A session at the end. And I mean that literally. I'm actually working with a philosopher on the ethics of autonomous vehicles now. So literally, if you want to ask philosophical questions, I'm totally game for that. But first, I want to talk a little bit about human race car drivers. And I also want to start off with one of my big pet peeves of autonomous driving. There's a real question in my mind. Obviously, people want autonomous vehicles to be safe. And this is one of the arguments that's often used. It's certainly one that's a huge personal motivator for me. That we should look at autonomous vehicles because we can dramatically improve vehicle safety. The usual argument is, well, why do we think autonomous vehicles will help? Well, human error is responsible for about 90% of accidents. And depending upon what statistics you're drawing from. That number can vary, but about that amount. And so if we eliminate the human, then we eliminate human error. And it's amazing how many newspaper articles I read that make this, or how many statements that I hear that make this claim. And I think this is absolutely false. And so if I accomplish nothing else in the course of the next year, I would love to kind of reframe this argument, because I feel that autonomous vehicles or automated vehicles do not eliminate human error at all. All they do is they shift it. They shift it from the driver to the program. Now, if you think about it, that's a really good shift in many cases. How many of you have been driving and think, I would love to hit the rewind button. If I could go back about 10 seconds, 15 seconds and behave differently, I would have. I mean, how many of us would like to be able to sit there and think about our most stressful driving situations, and instead of trying to solve those while you're behind the wheel, to say, I'd love to solve that while I'm sitting at the computer at the desk, going, yeah, maybe I shouldn't do it. No, why don't we try this? And be able to game that out. So there's a lot of advantages, potentially, with being able to shift from driving error to programming error. But it's a big challenge. And so if you think about this, what will programmers have to handle? Well, all manner of things. So what about the case of kids running out from a vehicle with very little warning? Maybe you've got a ball rolling out, and you can use that to predict. But you have to be able to think about the sort of things we intuit. Ball must be followed by child. Perfectly logical, all of us would think it, but are we going to think about it when we're programming? What about other things? Well, obviously, in Japan, there are some difficult pedestrian identification problems. I could get at Shibuya Station here. And as we think about things that can be used internationally, pedestrian detection and avoidance is a huge issue. I'll point out that that's not only internationally. In fact, there are some difficult things you might find in San Francisco. And if you think about it, it's like, well, all right, I'm programming the autonomous vehicle to understand cars, to understand bicycles, to understand pedestrians. I didn't actually program it to think about how to interpret a hot tub rolling down the street or a woolly mammoth. Now, we look at these things immediately, and we know what's going on. It's a parade. We've got context. We know how to handle it. But remember, we need, as programmers, to explicitly think of these things and give the car some rules to follow. Otherwise, the car's going to be stuck trying to figure out, what do I do in this situation? And if that seems far-fetched, think about the last time that you called up some automated telephone service. Press 1 if you want this, 2 if you want that, 3 if you want this. How many times do you listen through and go, I don't want any of those. Go straight to the operator, right? Unfortunately, there's not necessarily going to be an operator that the autonomous vehicle can go straight to. So I sort of approach this problem with equal parts of complete passion and terror. On the one hand, I think this is a fantastic opportunity. Imagine what we can do. Imagine all of the accident situations that we can take and turn into programming exercises. Imagine the number of people who would be with us here today if we could have done that years ago. Many members of my family and friends, I'm sure many of you have people in the audience who you would love to have here tonight. What an outstanding thing. I mean, this is why I became an engineer. At the same time, this is one of the most humbling problems I've ever looked at. Because how do you explain to somebody, I don't know why my computer is doing this, so I will periodically just do this. Excuse me? Don't say it. Yeah, don't say it. Let me just cancel out from that. Oh. Well, that lost a little bit of momentum. Now, I did make my point. Huh? Let me, yeah, exactly. That may be a human error as opposed to actual. I'm going to get this back. You watch. Okay. Any presentation will do. So why is it not? Where is my piece on the here's the files. Boom. All right. So there's a huge potential to save lives, but a big responsibility. And the question that I was going to pose in a dramatic fashion before my computer caused me to do other things is, how do you explain as a programmer to somebody that they lost their car or they lost their child because there was something that you didn't think of. This is, I think, the humbling responsibility. And this is a problem that we face, the potential to do unparalleled good. I mean, what else are we going to do as engineers that has the potential to save so many lives each year, but a huge responsibility? So this is a big puzzle, and obviously there's lots of pieces to it. Here's the one that we're attacking right now. There's many situations where the car's ability to move can be limited by the amount of friction in the environment. Maybe it's raining, maybe it's snowing, or maybe you need to get out of harm's way as quickly as possible. You don't have much space to maneuver, and you need to use all of the friction between the tire and the road to get out of trouble. So this is really a question that we've been asking. One class of accidents, clearly not everything, but one class of accidents involves needing to take all of the friction between the tire and the road and maneuver the vehicle safely out of harm's way. Well, there's a group of people who do this routinely, who are extremely good at it, and these are race car drivers. Now, they use all of the available friction to go fast, but as they say in racing, if you want to finish first you have to finish. Collision avoidance is actually a very important part of racing. Now, they are trying to push the car out to the very limits of friction for speed. We want to actually push it out to the very limits of friction to be safe, to basically execute any maneuver that would avoid an accident if the laws of physics say that maneuver is possible. So we started to ask, how do they do this and what can we learn? Now, I've been looking at vehicle dynamics for quite some time, I guess the dark ages, as Martin pointed out. And so this was a really interesting problem to me. So we started a project with Audi to see if we could race as well as the very best human drivers. And if we could race as well as the best human drivers, could this teach us how to design safer cars? Now, this was something that appealed to me because of my background in this area. So for those of you who aren't familiar with my background, we're going to give a quick rundown so you understand where I was coming from on this project. I started out getting my PhD at UC Berkeley working with the California PATH program, where I had the opportunity to work with Steve Schlatover, I think you heard from a couple months ago. So we were doing platooning of Lincoln Town cars down in San Diego, and I did the throttle and brake control for these vehicles. I then went on to work for Daimler-Benz and Freightliner and got to work on projects like this. I did multi-body dynamics and vehicle dynamics for large, heavy trucks like this airport rescue vehicle. After coming to Stanford, we built several vehicles in our lab, including a Chevy Corvette that we modified to be steer-by-wire, P1 and X1, which are entirely student-built drive-by-wire vehicles. Some of the design team is here in the room today. P1, we believe, is the world's first autonomous drifting car. And X1 is being used for a variety of studies now. I even do this stuff when I have a chance at free time. For a while, I was a crew chief on a quarter midget for my older son and take many opportunities to get out on the go-kart track. So having a lot of vehicle dynamics experience, it was really clear to me how to proceed with this problem of developing an autonomous race car. So pretty much the problem seemed pretty straightforward to me. We're going to find the best single path around the track. Now this is great. We have computers. We can optimize this. We can really nail the best way around the track. Once we do, we're going to have a big advantage over the human who is trying to figure this out from their eyes and from various sensors and things like that. Doggone it, we can nail the line around the track. Once we have that, we'll drive right up below the limits that the tires have. So tires have some sort of limits. If we get, I don't know, I wasn't sure what the number was, 85, 90% or so of the way there on the optimal line, we should just be moving around the track. We're faster and we declare victory. So this problem set out very clearly for me even before we started working on it. Now the problem was, it turns out this wasn't really all that important to find the single best path around the track. When we found a really good path, it really didn't give us any advantage. We were able to very successfully drive just below the tire limits, and we were slow. So, if you still want to listen to the talk after realizing how little I understood, I'd like to share with you why these things were true. Thank you. Okay. It's going to be a night like that, isn't it? I want to make sure I hit the right button here and get us back. Boom. So why? Well, what we're going to do is take a look at racing lines. So I'm going to show you some data that we've recorded from expert race car drivers. We're going to break down a little bit about what they do. We're going to produce some of our own racing lines and compare them and then show you how they drive with Shelly, which is the autonomous Audi TTS that we've developed with Audi in the Electronics Research Lab, and then compare that with an expert driver. Doggone it. And then what I want to do is to extend these lessons to collision avoidance. And what is causing interference. I may try and plug this in a minute. Okay, so how do drivers go around a racetrack? Well, they do it in a way that's called the cornering sequence. This is really key to understanding things here, so I want to do with you what I do with my classes at Stanford and ask you to stand up here for a moment. I want you to truly understand what it's like to drive around the track, around the racing line. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through this corner. This is turn 11 in Laguna Seca. It's the tightest turn on the track. So we're going to go in here on the straight, and if you're on the straight, you either want to be accelerating or braking at all times. Right? So we're going to brake into the corner. We're going to ease off the brakes as we start to go around the corner. We're going to corner, and then we're going to ease out of the corner as we begin to accelerate. What this will do is move us along the friction circle. When we brake, we're going to use all of the car's friction for braking. Then we're going to ease off braking and use it all ultimately for cornering, ease off of the corner, and ultimately use it all for acceleration. So anytime we're on the straight, we only want to be accelerating or braking. All right, so you're in your car and you accelerate. What do you feel? Okay, some of you definitely need a better car. Can you get some deals on the GTR or something like these programs? No. Okay. Even the Leaf, for crying out loud, you do more than that. That thing's pretty zippy. All right. So if you push your foot on the accelerator pedal, right, you go back. And now when you brake, you go forward. Great. When you're turning, you go to the. We're only going to make left turns here because I grew up in North Carolina, and that's kind of all we do on the racetrack. So we're going to make some left turns. So we're going to go here into turn 11 at Laguna Seca. So you're driving on the straight. You're driving on the straight into this corner. What should you be doing? Not yet. We haven't approached the corner. We're on the straight, but we're not yet at the corner, so we should be accelerating. Everybody accelerate. Now we see the corner, and so what do you want to do? Brake hard as you can. All right, now you go into the corner, so you want to ease off of the brakes as you start to corner. Now you want to ease off of the steering as you accelerate. Okay, now as we go to the next turn, we're on the long straight, so we accelerate for a long time. Accelerate. Next corner comes up, we brake down into the corner. Then you ease off of the brakes as you go into the corner. Ease off of the steering as you accelerate, brake. Okay, now do that several hundred more times so you've got a sense of what's going on. This is what's going out on the track. The combination of the path that you want to take and this idea of always maximizing where you are on the friction circle. Now, your engine limits will actually generally dictate how much you can accelerate, but all cars should be capable of locking up the brakes. So you can really brake at the maximum of the friction circle. Okay, thanks for participating. You may have a seat now. So the thing is, do we see this from real race car drivers? Well, luckily we have a program. Greg, you're the man, thank you. Luckily we have a program with a sponsor who owns a fine collection of vintage race cars, Mr. Miles Collier. So this is his 1960 Porsche Abarth Carrera, serial number 1001. And he actually liked our stuff enough to let us mount GPS antennas and various sensors all over the cars. We had to get kind of creative because he didn't let us drill things the way our colleagues at Audi and VW do. But we actually instrumented a variety of cars. I'll show you some data from various cars and some fantastic drivers. This is John Morton, who is a former IMSA racer, a class champion at Le Mans. Fantastic race car driver. As those of you who work with this stuff know, it doesn't always work. This is the first celebration when we actually got data, which wasn't necessarily the first time the car went out on the track. But we've gotten pretty good at getting data from vintage race cars. And so as we compared this, we found some interesting things. This is turn 2 at Laguna Seca, known as the Andretti hairpin. And what you'll see here in blue is a line driven by Bruce Canepa. Bruce is the president of the track. He grew up with dirt track racing, quarter midgets and things, and actually set a record driving up Pikes Peak in a semi for the hill climb. So Bruce is that kind of guy. John Morton, a little bit more conventional in his racing style than Bruce. He learned to drive very gently because he said he came up without any funding and he couldn't brake the car because he didn't have money to repair it. So he learned to do shifting and everything very smoothly. Now these guys have a very different approach to this corner. What Bruce does is what's known as a double apex. So you see he comes in and he'll steer in to hit this point of the turn, go a little bit wide, steer in and hit this other point of the turn and go out. John does what's known as a late apex. So he drives out and he goes a little bit wide and then hits it, the apex of the turn right on exit, and does this very cleanly. Now these are lines that are both recorded in a 1963 Corvette Grand Sport that we tested just this past August. And I want to show you what that looks like inside. So first we're going to watch Bruce, and you're going to watch the steering wheel, and you'll see when he actually literally goes towards the apex twice. Okay, so what you'll look for is Bruce is doing 2 deliberate steer-ins. John will tend to go around the corner and steer in here. All right, so here's Bruce. He goes in. Boom, you see the steering as he finds that apex. Now he swings a little wide, hits it again, and out he goes on to the straight. Okay, here's John. He goes in, you see a little bit deeper into the turn. You see him away from the center. He hits it right there on the apex and then straightens out onto the track on his way out. Well, we thought, well, this is great because, we've got 2 incredibly good drivers here. We can actually compare their lap times and sort of see who's got the better strategy around the track. So we compared their lap times here. This is both from their very best laps. They had no cars in front or behind them, so these were pretty clean laps. And when we broke it down, the 2 lap times were within 4/100ths of a second of each other. Now, stop and think about that for a moment. How many of you have actually programmed a simulation, a mathematical model, anything that you did mathematically that you tried to represent the real world? Anybody? Did everybody do that? Yeah, okay. How many of you got within 0.04% of the correct answer? Not a lot of hands. I mean, when we do sorts of things, well, let's make small angle approximations. Let's do these sorts of things. Usually we're thinking 10%. These guys are within 0.4% of each other. Now you can say, well, Bruce clearly wins, but John drove the car the second week and we had set it up better. Or excuse me, John drove it the first week, Bruce drove it the second weekend and we had set it up better. So you can say, well, maybe he's got a slight advantage there. But the fact of the matter is, these guys, driving around the track in wildly different ways, with their own style, managed to get out to a very consistent lap time. Their best lap times are close to other laps that they've run, but also extremely close to each other. This is a kind of interesting thing. So let's look at a different comparison. What we're going to do is we're going to look at Bruce. This is, again, his best lap in blue, and red was when he was going for the lead of the race. So he's got another car here that he's going to be overtaking, which is over to the right. So you'll see that he's moving inside, and he's going to brake heavily and go around here and pass his car. So there you see the Shelby out there. Bruce is going to brake, out brakes him into the corner, still does the double apex, and blows him away. Basically, regardless of whether he's racing a vintage car or something like that, Bruce is not going to be denied on his track if he has equivalent equipment. So let's take a look at that. How do those segment times compare? Well, in his best lap, he got through this segment at 12.26 seconds. On his passing lap, he was faster. Okay, now wait a minute. That's a little bit mind-blowing because clearly we know you need to swing to the outside of the track in order to be fast, but he found another line that goes on the inside. Now, if you look at it, you can sort of break this down and say, well, there's a couple of things that were going on. First of all, he pushed it much harder around the corner here. So if he had been in a long race, he would have worn the tires out more. But second of all, he was a little bit slower coming out of this corner. And this is where it becomes really difficult to look at individual corners, because it turns out that there's very different initial and final conditions. And so we find that race car drivers may exceed something in one corner, and then the other car falls behind, but they make it up in the next corner, because they set up with better initial conditions. So the corners are very tightly linked, and so sacrificing speed in one corner to gain in the next makes sense. But as we set up the optimizer, there was something that really kind of fell out of this, that in general you have a trade-off between how you go around the corner. I can go to a larger radius, which lets me go faster, or I can actually take a shorter path more slowly. But if you think about it, that sort of starts to offset. And so it turns out that you can find a lot of good ways around a racetrack. Now, that's not to say that any arbitrary path is going to be fast, quite the opposite. But there's more than one way to be fast around the path. So our question really became not how do we find the best, but can we find one of these? And the man who helped us out on this is Piero Taruffi. Piero Taruffi is my new hero. Piero Taruffi had a doctorate in engineering from the University of Rome and was a winning Grand Prix driver. He won the Mille Miglia in Italy and was just all around a cool guy who I wish was here to join our meetup, because I'm sure he would. He might even come to your parties in high school, Greg. I don't know. It seemed like he was a party kind of guy. He liked all sorts of sports, like motor racing. He wrote this great book in 1959 where he broke down all these corners and said the racing line is smooth. So we can think about it really in these simple segments, curves, arcs, and these transition segments, which we interpreted to mean clothoids, things that change linearly with curvature, because they're basically the simplest possible curve. And so we took Piero Taruffi's ideas and said, well, can we match this to what race car drivers are doing? So we went up north of here a little bit to Thunder Hill Raceway Park, which has some fantastically interesting curves, including turn 5, which is over a hill, and this chicane here, 11, 12, and 13. We had the president of the track take our Audi around, and this is a comparison of his line. I gotta get you hitting me again there, Greg, thanks. His line and the line taken by the Audi, or excuse me, by our fitting algorithm with clothoids. Turns out you can go around the entire track, and with no more than about 20 centimeters of error, you can reduce the sort of 54,000 points, in other words, 27,000 XY data locations, to about 112 straights, clothoids, or arcs. We can take the path that the race car driver is doing, break it down into these very, very simple curve shapes, and it represents the track extremely well. So we thought, well, this is good. If it's not really about finding a single best line, then making this family of curves is likely to give us a reasonably fast line. So we thought from this, all right, if the racing lines are smooth paths, we can capture this with fairly simple curve shapes, at least within the range of driver variability and other things. If there's many racing lines that seem equivalently fast, based upon what we've seen from skilled race car drivers and what our optimization tells us, then we should be able to find fast lines using the straights, arcs, and clothoids. So normally this is where I go into the math of this, but it seems like there's probably more interesting things to discuss tonight. I can bring up the math later, but for now, I'm just going to say not only should we be able to find racing lines mathematically, but we can. So what does it look like at the end of the day? I'm going to show you a comparison between a line around Thunder Hill Raceway Park driven by the president of the track and one that we calculated based on these algorithms. Now, basically what we're going to find is that the human drives a very good line. The human race car driver is able to find one of these paths around the track that is extremely, extremely good. But the human is going to make very different choices between minimum distance and maximum radius than our algorithm does. And so you'll see as this goes around the track, I've got the time separation down in the corner. And you're going to see that our car wins around one corner and loses it around the next. That the two lines trade off against each other by making these different decisions. Now we win, according to our simulation model that we used to develop this, but basically it's 0.3 seconds on a lap time of around 2 minutes and 17 seconds. So, am I willing to assert that my model is that good? No, I'm not. So it turns out that as we do all of this optimization, we come up with a racing line that seems to be slightly better, but is to some extent within the noise of what we record from an excellent human driver. So as you watch here, here's a comparison. Around certain turns, you see we calculate exactly the same solution. Now here's a big constant radius. I really apologize. I have not had this sort of problem before. Here's a big constant radius turn, and you see that we've got a very different trade-off between shortest distance and maximum radius. And yet, trading off back and forth, we're still about 1/10 of a second apart. Now going up to the top of the hill, we calculate almost exactly the same line. Coming off of it again, at one of these different trade-offs between distance and radius. As we get out to the edge of the track, you see that it starts to look very, very similar in terms of the desired shape. The lines are almost overlapping each other. But then we get to this point where we're in fact able to calculate the shortest distance, whereas the human driver has to go off of visual elements, and so we actually run ahead. Rather similar through this chicane and out onto the final turns. Here you see we make a mistake because we actually stay within the lines, whereas the human driver says, I can drive off a little bit. And it's a little bit of that arch back. All right, so as we pull towards the finish line, our time difference is about 0.31 seconds. So with all of this, all of this optimization, all of this math that we throw at the problem, and we come up with something that is within the noise of the president of the track in a car that he's barely driven before. Pretty extraordinary. And I know this is a meetup about autonomous vehicles, but I never cease to be impressed by the human. And bring up the issue that, yes, there's a lot of times when I would love my car to drive itself. But on the other hand, when I look at what the best humans can do in a car, I'm pretty inspired to try for that as well. Yes?
Quick comment. When I auto cross, the first thing I do is turn off the traction control.
Yes.
Because you leave it on and you're
Yes.
very slow.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yes. So we turned all the systems off, both for David Vaughn and when we do the stuff in the Audi, we turn off all those systems and do it ourselves. I think the point I'd like to kind of take from that comment and throw it out there is that these systems are designed to help the average driver handle certain driving situations. A combination of systems designed to help the average driver does not produce the performance of the best drivers. And I think that's important as we think about these things going forward.
So what's the lap time?
The lap time with the Audi TT is, and the tires that we use, is about 2 minutes and 17 seconds. These aren't race tires. These are street tires with a certain amount of wear on that. So if you're thinking, well, it's Thunder Hill, it should be 2 minutes and 6 seconds. If I'm talking about a Spec Miata, we're not dealing with that quality of race tire, and that makes a huge difference. So how well can we actually drive this? Can we do the same thing? If we know the desired path and the acceleration profile, can we drive it as well as a human? So this is Shelly, our Audi TTS, where we have seized control of the electronic throttle, steering, and braking. These are pretty near-stock systems. We've added GPS, which we're primarily using for localization on the track. We've added some front LiDAR, which we're using for obstacle avoidance things right now. And we decided to take it out to the track and see if we could track this. Now, there's sort of another talk in terms of how we develop the algorithms for that, but I'll just point out a couple of things that are necessary. We can get a good understanding of what the throttle, brake, and steering commands should be, but we also need feedback. Because when you're driving right up to the limits of the tires, you need to be able to correct when you exceed them. And the two basic corrections that we do are, first of all, we have a lane-keeping based system where we look at the projected error out in front of the vehicle. And so we can move it back onto the path if we swing wide, but we can also correct if our heading error is wrong. And our heading error may be very wrong in an oversteer situation as the car starts to spin, as you'll see in a moment. Then we actually look at the tires and what the slip characteristics are on the tires. So if we understand that there's a certain amount of force or slip that the tires can handle in the longitudinal and lateral directions, much as you all pantomimed for the overall car, we can monitor what's happening in each tire. And if we see one of these things beginning to lock up or beginning to slide out, we can take some corrective action as well. So you put this together and you get the following. Here's Shelly out on the track. With the differential GPS, you see we can steer in and do a really good job of just bringing it right up to the apex and out to the edge of the track as well, depending upon how daring the grad students are feeling. Now you see we come down to the apex again, and if you look inside the car, that looks pretty chill. Right? Going along pretty happily, steering as it needs to. Now we come up to the hill here, and see the car is capable of doing a lot of really excellent work to do a combination of braking and steering. So you see the car now has to brake heavily as it goes into the turn, again going right up close to the apex, accelerating down. And from the inside, we've got a minor steering twitch to correct, and we're back, tracking the path once again. We can get up to some pretty decent speeds on the track. This is zooming ahead a little bit as we go up the hill on the far side of the track. Again, trying to use as much space as possible, which is really important if you want a fast lap time. We get some serious speed, have to brake heavily, turn left, out to the apex, turn right over a blind hill, and then if you watch, the car can find a straight path here, even as the road is wandering. So it actually, this is where it makes up some of its time on the track from finding that. Just to show you, it's not always that easy. Here's a day when it was, that's actually a good pause. I can give a little bit more setup here. Here's a day where it was very hot and the brakes faded. And so as we went into the corner in turn one, it turns out we didn't have quite as much friction as we thought. So you can see what that looks like here. Again, we go out to the edge to get into turn 1. Come down in, and whoa, it's a little bit sideways. Look at it from the inside, you can see what's happening with the steering wheel. And, let me see if I can accelerate it through, just to give you that. For those of you shopping for a new laptop, I'm not really going to recommend this. All right, no, actually, it's a Lenovo Yoga. And so if you watch the steering wheel there, you see we have some pretty dramatic recovery needed, but the car gets right back on track and begins to attack the next corner. So it's just as crazy as the average race car driver.
Question.
Yeah.
Did you ever have a situation where you ran off the track?
Yes. Yes, quite honestly, we are really pushing it right up to the edge of the limits of what it can do. And so there have been times, particularly times when it's been raining up there, where you're testing something and it just goes a little bit too far. One of the situations that I thought was most interesting with that was a time that I actually decided to take control of the car just as it was going to begin its braking up the top of the hill. Now I've been monitoring, I've spent a lot of time, many hours in this car with one hand on hovering above the steering wheel and the other hand over the big red button. And I took control of that car and I immediately got on the brakes, but immediately wasn't fast enough. And so the car ended up jumping off in the track far worse than it would have if I had just let it steer around. So there's kind of some interesting lessons here as we think about takeover scenarios. Yes?
Question, do you need to detect those kind of like out of boundary situation, like where you need to maybe kick in with some like specific recovery algorithms, or it's all handled by the same model?
So yes and yes. Yes, we need to do that, and I'm going to talk about that in 2 slides. It's sort of my finishing thought. I know that wasn't in what you saw right now.
Oh,
So this was simply just steering back with the simple feedback laws.
And in 2D or 3D maps, because your close eyes are they 2D or 3D because you have a lot of hills in there.
Yes, we have grade and bank that vary along as well. I will say that there is probably some significant room for improvement in how we're handling that, but the car does know over the course of the racing line an approximation of the grade and bank of the track. This becomes obviously extremely important when you have these large hills and you have these downhill situations.
Do you do any calibrations before the racetrack of the road conditions?
Yeah, we do. We try to be as physically driven as possible. So we don't like to go out and tune too many different games. We like to try to do everything as much as possible with physical parameters. But the thing is, any of you who've ever done racing know your tire property is going to change tremendously as your tires wear and as the temperature of the track changes. Those of you who've been at Thunder Hill know that you can have a nice, pleasant, like 75 degrees in the morning and you're dealing with 110 in the afternoon. That's a little bit different in terms of the tire parameters. So one of the things that we will do is to generally do a ramp sphere test to get some basic characterization of the tires that we use as a baseline, but then the car can vary that as it goes. So we do calibration on that. Yeah?
Are you using a constant estimation of mean for the entire track, or are you doing it online?
Yes and no. Depending upon what we're doing, we do have the capability of estimating it, and I'm going to motivate that in a moment. In the particular video that you saw with the recovery, we were not doing online estimation of that. So if you look at it, this is the friction circle that you all drove so well, standing up. And as you see, our car does a really nice job going through the accelerating, the braking, and along the edges of this. This is really the engine limit, which varies according to speed, because it's essentially a power limit. But you see, we do a great job of doing that. We do a great job of controlling tire slip, and yet we're still not as fast as the president of the track. We're getting there, but we're still a few seconds behind him. Well, it turns out that if you look at these are representing the slip circles or the capabilities of the tires. We do a really nice job of staying in there, except when we're braking and have to do sort of the ABS functionality and it dips out for a moment. We do a pretty nice job, except on a couple of those spins, of staying within the slip circle on the rear tire. And you see that, oops, oh, we're going to go online with this. That'll make it even more exciting.
Online.
I think if you just go down to the, yeah. Perfect. Thanks, Greg. So we do a nice job of respecting the limits of the tires, and the human driver doesn't. The human driver is actually content to go way out here in the front, saturate the tire tremendously to make sure that they're never below the limits. So not only is the human driver able to get a racing line about as good as we can calculate from optimization, they don't obey the slip circle limits. They don't stay within the lines. Our great controller getting 80-90% of the slip circle is not fast. It's slow because we're leaving that little bit on the table. So it turns out it's not that simple as just to say, well, all right, let us saturate the front tires, because then you're plowing. You're plowing through the turn. It turns out we don't know exactly what the friction limit is, and many of your questions have brought this up. How do you know what mu really is? It changes with tire temperature and track pressure, and drivers are amazing at sensing this. I talked with Gilles Ferrin, who won the Indy 500, and he's done a lot of tire testing, and I asked him, I said, well, how many laps does it take you when you put on a brand new set of tires that you've never driven before? It's a new formulation. How many laps does it take you to get up to the absolute limits of the car? And he looked at me and he goes, laps? Chris, I wouldn't have a job if it took me laps. 2 turns. 2 turns and you're up. He's like, you've got to have a local understanding of how everything changes with the tire. So you get 2 turns and you're off and running at the limits of the car. So it turns out that a little uncertainty and friction can cause big problems. And this is the picture I like best to illustrate this. This is coming into a turn at about, this is meters per second, so coming in at about 52 meters per second into the turn here. I've got a 3% error in friction. Right, so this would be about what's happening as I'm coming into some of my faster turns at Thunder Hill. If I've got a 3% error in friction, if I think friction is greater than it is, then you see as I come into the turn, I'm braking, but I'm not slowing down quite as much as I think I should be. So as I come around here on the friction circle, now I'm going a little bit too fast. So I actually need a little bit more of that friction to stay in the turn than I thought, which means there's a little bit less available for braking, which means I'm going slightly too fast, which means I need a little bit more for lateral acceleration. And so I can't possibly get to my desired speed profile. I end up coming here not at 35 meters per second, but at 36.5 meters per second. And you say, hey Chris, what's 1.5 meters per second among friends here, right? Well, if you translate that into radius, that's 12 meters. Okay, that's a big difference. If I have misestimated friction, if I'm trying to drive up to the limits, and I've misestimated this by 3%, which is awesome if I can get it within 3%, I'm off the track. I'm not only missing the apex, I'm missing the pavement on this. So it turns out that this whole entry problem, this idea of braking before I get into a turn, is a very stiff mathematical problem. And so we've got basically 2 options to this. One is to go in conservatively, which is where we thought we could do. That's not going to make us fast. The other is to change our path based on conditions. But if we do that, our controller really is no longer hierarchical. And so many people who look at autonomous vehicles say, well, we do path planning, and then we go and we do things with a low-level controller. So if you try to do this in that fashion, good luck. Because the path planner says do this, and the low-level controller goes, no friction. You can't do that. So several things that we've learned from this that really, I think, are very interesting to developing autonomous vehicles. Much of the path planning for autonomous vehicles comes out of the computer science field, where you'll generally think of the world as a grid and say, let's connect the dots and then smooth it. It turns out that if you start with this sort of connect the dots and smooth it, you rarely end up with one of these smooth paths that the race car drivers generate. There are many fast ways around a racetrack, but this is not the way to find one. So the whole approach of thinking about working around the limits, thinking about getting up to the limits of the car, you want to be smooth and then fit that smooth path around the obstacles, as opposed to thinking about something that fits around the obstacles and then smoothing it. So clearly there's a need to sense friction. We've got several approaches to doing this, and then to adapt the path according to new information, so that the controller can really pay attention, go into a maneuver, realize it doesn't have as much friction as it thought, and very quickly replan the maneuver. It turns out that driving the path is the challenge. Finding the path is really not that bad. Finding a path around a racetrack is not the problem that we thought it was. So how do we use all of this? Well, I want to take this from just a pure racing setting and leave you with how this relates to day-to-day life. So I want to look at a lane change maneuver. So we're going to look at an emergency lane change where we're coming in at highway speeds, and and we suddenly need to change lanes to get around the car. So we want to basically brake and corner to get around this and then accelerate again so we're up to the speed of the traffic in the other lane. Well, it turns out we can do the same thing with the straights, clothoids, and other things that we did on the racetrack. We can use exactly the same algorithms to be able to drive this. And so if we do that, it looks like this, which I'm going to have to do manually because that was the one change which I didn't save earlier in here. This is from the roof of the car. What you're going to see is we're going to go to the start-finish line. When we go to the start-finish line, the car senses that there's a blocked lane in front of it and executes an emergency maneuver. So it goes 1, 2, there's the start-finish line, wham. It's able to do the emergency maneuver. This is what it looks like from the in-car view. The human heads here are kind of your G meter as they move to the side and move back. And finally, this is what it looks like if you are the obstacle. See the camera shake a little bit. We recorded that the first time, and we put it on the center of the obstacle, which made a lot of sense for perspective. And then we're like, no, we need to put it on the edge of the obstacle. It's much, much cooler. Okay, so my goal here has been to hopefully convince you that by looking at the world's best drivers, we can learn a lot that helps us with autonomous vehicles. So first of all, I think a measure of respect is in order. Humans can be amazing drivers. They are truly extraordinary how they can get to the limits of the car's capability. So we really want to take lessons from them. More than one good trajectory exists. We don't necessarily have to get hung up on the optimal trajectory. So